All right. So, oh, make sure I pin this before we get going. I'll go through a couple things before we kind of dive into material here today. Uh, so the exam went pretty well. I'll mention some things at the end about it. There was one question, I think it was question one. I ended up kind of going through and regrading it to give two possible solutions to it because it was worded a little bit unclear. So those should have been updated before I even posted the grades. Um, Other than that, that module five reading, I put up an announcement and then mentioned it last week. That was due before we met today, because that's what we're going to be covering. I also put an announcement that module six was going to be due before we started class Tuesday, so that's tomorrow, because we'll go through all of module five today. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. Um, we'll kind of reuse a lot of it for module six, and we'll have really a little bit more time, more than just two class periods to spend on module six. So we'll be starting that tomorrow. So that module reading is due before we start class tomorrow. We've got all the materials for module six already up there, so we can kind of dive into that. And then you'll see today's module, or sorry, today's daily quiz we will use later on in the class period as well. Okay. I've also updated the assignments tab so that it weights everything according to the syllabus. So we've got our module readings, our daily quizzes, our Canvas discussion, and the first exam. All of those are being weighted according to the syllabus, with the exception of that midterm exam is taking the weight of all exams currently. So if you don't do as well in the other two, that, some of the weight on this is going to go down. Some of that weight will go on your exam too, as we progress throughout the semester. Um, so I want to do that so that I don't give you like an overinflated idea of your grade, because a lot more of these module readings and daily quizzes are easier points. And so I want to kind of have it reflected. If you do as well on the next two exams as you did on that midterm, this is what your grade would be. Other than that, I don't think I have anything else to mention unless there's any questions that anybody has before we kind of dive into material here from module five. Okay. Um, Make sure, yeah, there we go. So we will go to slides here and we'll kind of start. So when we think about economies and whether or not we're in the long or the short run, how does that relate to growth? So that's what we're going to start with today. So here we're going to think about long run scenarios. We'll kind of move to short run tomorrow, but today we're just talking about long run. So we've got our long run aggregate supply curve. It's going to look a little bit different than supply curves like if you took B251. So our long run aggregate supply is going to, excuse me, is going to be what we call potential GDP. So it's if we use all of our resources, right? So our current levels of labor, capital, we're working at our kind of current productivity level. All of these resources we have to make or generate output in our economy are being what we call fully employed or being used. Okay? So really, we talked about these already in a previous modules and class periods, labor, capital. We had land and raw materials like other categories, but for the most part, we're going to focus on labor and capital. So if we're using all of these long run aggregate supply, that's the highest supply we can get to. That's the highest potential GDP given our current resources. Okay. Now we don't have to have necessarily everybody employed. Excuse me. Employing our resources um, fully would mean that we've achieved that natural rate of unemployment. So not kind of factoring in any cyclical unemployment, removing that, we're at that natural rate. Okay. We also assume everyone has complete information in these markets. That's just an assumption that um, no one person is going to be able to have an advantage in setting prices because they have information others don't. So that's just kind of a standard assumption we have in most economic models, which then results that our markets are going to be in equilibrium. All right, all of our goods markets, all of our financial markets, everything's going to be in equilibrium in our long run. We also assume that technology is constant, or the current level of technology is what it is and it's not changing. We have no way of just currently in this time period changing technology. It would take more time to kind of make that improvement. We are also going to adjust for prices, which means we're not going to be looking at nominal GDP. We're thinking about potential GDP. What adjusts for prices? Real GDP. So price changes shouldn't matter in terms of what our long run outcome is. Okay. And we'll kind of see this. I'll touch back on this as we kind of move through the class period today. So if long run aggregate supply is not impacted by prices, right? We're measuring potential GDP in real terms. Then as we see the price level change, well, what's going to happen to the total level of output? Well, it's kind of like if we have the same income, right? But, or sorry, I should say it this way. If we are adjusting for prices, right, then the number of units we can afford with our given income doesn't ever change, right? The level of output we can grow is going to be the same regardless of what that price level is. Or think about it this way, regardless of the price level, when we're using all of our resources, if we're using all the resources, it doesn't matter what the price is, we can only produce this amount, right? So we're going to end up with our supply curve in this model is actually a vertical line that as the price changes, our real GDP or our output levels don't change at all, right? The same amount. Oops, I scrolled the wrong way. So we've got this vertical long run aggregate supply curve. We're then going to think about, okay, what's going to cause changes to this long run aggregate supply curve? So really, it's just notation differences from what we've already talked about in previous modules. So we'll now think about kind of the definition we typically see or the notation we see as pull. So that stands for productivity, right? Or better technologies. O is going to be our physical capital or other natural resources or raw materials. L is going to represent labor. E is human capital. Well, we could just rewrite this a little bit and notice what was our real GDP before? It was some function of labor, capital, natural resources, which we kind of ignored. We really only focused on labor and capital, and then human capital multiplied by some productivity factor. We're doing the same thing here. It's just that we're kind of using slightly different notation. Okay. But at the end of the day, it's going to be these things that are changing that impact the level of output. So we're eventually going to get to the aggregate demand curve and things that shift aggregate demand. For aggregate supply, you can think of it as though it has to be something in order for long run aggregate supply to change, it measures output. So we need something that changes that literally impacts the number of possible units of something we could produce. If my workers become more effective through human capital, if I have better technologies, the same number of workers produces more output. If I have more machinery, I can get more output from the same number of workers. And if I just have more workers, I can have more people employed on tasks that create output. So anything that's generating kind of differences or changing output impacts our real GDP, which is essentially just our long run aggregate supply. Oops, let me scroll here. Oh, there we go. Which was this vertical supply curve. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? And I'll draw this out here in a second. But before we do, let's go back here. I don't know why this is shifted up my picture. I think it has something to do with I updated PowerPoint before since the last time I created these. So what does this shift in long run aggregate supply look like? Right? Well, if I think about, we looked at this model a little bit last module. If I see that given all of my resources, I can produce more consumption and at the same time capital goods, or this expansion or this increase out in our production possibilities curve told us, well, what is this production possibilities curve? It's all the combinations of these two goods we could produce using all of our resources. So if we can produce more of both goods at our new kind of resource level, we've really increased our real GDP, or that long run aggregate supply would shift to the right. So just like models you looked at in B251 or other models we'll look at, shifts to the right are increases, shifts to the left would be decreases. Right? And the same, well, now from that same number of workers, if we have better technology, we can get higher levels of output. So the same investment into either factor of production, capital or labor, with new technology, we can produce more than before. Well, if our real GDP increases because of this productivity or technology change, that's going to then cause our long and aggregate supply to also increase. So we want to be thinking about real GDP as output, right? We were controlling for prices. It should just measure output. Okay. Excuse me. Sorry. Um, so however, remember that in the short run, we might not actually be at full employment. So potential GDP or long run aggregate supply might vary, right? It's our potential GDP. It might vary from the actual GDP if we currently have higher or lower unemployment because of these cyclical changes in the economy. So if we look at this graph, why did we see such a difference? So this red line is our potential GDP. Blue line is the actual GDP. Why was it so much lower in 2020? Well, we had the COVID restrictions. We had a lot of resources that weren't being used. So they would still be factored into potential GDP in our long run, long run model. But in the short run, they're not currently being used. We might be at a real GDP that's below our potential long run value. And then, in other time periods, sometimes we're below, right? Because we have like maybe some cyclical unemployment that keeps us a little bit below the potential kind of GDP. And then some time periods, maybe if the economy is rebounding, we can see that it's slightly above potential GDP. But that in the long run, we kind of follow this trend line, right, for real potential real GDP. Okay. Make sure there's nothing in the chat. Okay. So we're kind of setting ourselves up here to build a full model. So we went through aggregate supply. Let's go through long run aggregate demand. So with long run aggregate demand, what we're going to end up seeing is that this isn't a nice, vertical, like the supply curve, that it's actually going to be related to prices. So at different price levels, aggregate demand, right, you think about is how many units or what output do individuals want to buy? Well, if prices go up, people are going to want to buy or consume less, holding everything else constant. This idea that if we buy more at lower prices or we buy less at higher prices sounds pretty similar to markets from B251, just the market for goods. So it really gets to be kind of a similar thought process. However, when we think about demand here, it's not the demand for one product, it's the demand for consumption of all products. So when we're using that expenditure approach, so once again, like once we get closer to the next exam, it won't be cumulative and I'm not going to ask you module 3 type questions, but it's comprehensive and that we're going to start reusing these old concepts that we talked about over and over and just kind of, I don't want to say complicate them a little bit more, but kind of expound upon them or build upon them. So this expenditure approach we had to calculating real GDP was consumption, investment into capital, government spending, net exports. So we can think about any expenditures in any of these categories should increase aggregate demand. So our aggregate demand curve is really just calculating real GDP using the expenditure approach. So nothing too new here. So as price levels go down, we can think of this as people want to consume more. We can also think about our real GDP calculation. So when we see changes in prices, we just move along the curve. So the reason why, if I can get this to transition, there we go, is how did we calculate real GDP? Well, it was our nominal GDP divided by our price deflator. So we said as prices decrease, our GDP deflator would actually get lower, which would then increase our real GDP. Okay. So if we have a lower price, that means we adjust for that, our GDP deflator is lower and our real GDP would be higher. So as prices go down, our real output should go up, which is what our demand curve is going to suggest. As price levels go down, when we then adjust for prices, our real GDP would be higher, or we have a downward sloping demand curve. So changes in prices, which influence that GDP deflator, say holding constant, right? Kind of our real GDP, in order to kind of get that same level, we would have to think about, well, we haven't done shifts yet, but after a shift, we would need a lower price level. Or for right now, we can think about as that price decreases, that lowers our GDP deflator, which then, oh, I don't want to say convert, which then adjusts the nominal GDP to our real GDP is going to be a little bit lower. So changes in prices, just like when we have like a good market that you might have learned about in B251, it moves us along that aggregate demand curve. Okay. Anything other than the changes in the price level of the economy, that's going to cause shifts. So what do we have that's going to happen that shifts our aggregate demand? Excuse me. We can think about that here in a second. So differentiating the two before we then think about demand shifters, aggregate demand is the current expenditure. So what is actually being bought in our economy? Aggregate supply is what we could, the maximum amount, and that's another way of thinking about the potential GDP and long run aggregate supply. It's the maximum amount of output we could get if we were using all of our factors of production. So it's the potential or what we could be producing, aggregate demand, that's what we are currently purchasing or consuming. Okay. So once again, why is this potential GDP? It's the highest potential, the highest possible GDP we could get using all of our factors of production. Just because we're using all of them to produce output doesn't mean all that output is being purchased, right? So if we ever see, right, that those two things are equal, so actual and potential real GDP are the same, well, right, then we would kind of think about that's kind of our long run equilibrium, right? Everything being purchased is being consumed. So we'll take a look at this here in a second. Actually, before I do shifts, let's just actually draw that out just to kind of give an idea here. So what is our model going to look like? We can kind of combine these two things now. So we'll have our long run aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We've got our real GDP and we've got price levels. We said our long run aggregate supply is going to be this vertical curve. We then have our aggregate demand curve. So where is our equilibrium point going to be? Where long run aggregate supply is equal to our long run aggregate demand, meaning our price would be here and our real GDP equilibrium would be here. If it helps, we could think about this as like my equilibrium points. Okay. Now, what we could see, and I'm going to jump the gun and not talk about causes here for a second, is what happens if aggregate demand increases. Since we're here right now, I'll give an example and we'll probably come back and do some other ones. Well, if I have an aggregate demand increase, that means that at every price level, my real GDP is now higher. Because if I adjust for prices, then even at the same price level, if aggregate demand is going up, that means I have more kind of consumption or the amount of goods that are being consumed is higher. I'm going to see that aggregate demand shift to the right. Once again, if you've taken B251, it kind of works the same way. Increases in aggregate demand is always going to be shifts to the right, whereas decreases in aggregate demand are shifts to the left. Okay. And then what did that do to my equilibrium price? Well, my new equilibrium price is here, right? So it increased prices, but what happened to my real GDP? Stayed exactly the same. So these aggregate demand increases cause prices to go up, but no change. Here, this might be hard to read. No change in my real GDP. Because anything that changes my aggregate demand or changes consumption or expenditures, it hasn't produced or hasn't increased my potential number of units I can produce. It's just changing how much people are willing to buy. Okay. So potential real GDP stays the same. Higher demand leads to people are willing to pay higher equilibrium prices, but it doesn't change the potential GDP. It doesn't change what our economy can actually produce. It changes how much people want to buy, right? But not what's actually being produced. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. So, what are some of these things that, oh, there we go, that shift our aggregate demand curve? Okay. So, we already kind of mentioned changes in the price, the overall price level of that economy will just move us to different points on that aggregate demand curve. Right? Now, what happens if something other than that price changes? Well, now we see shifts. I kind of already alluded in the drawing, shifts to the right or increases. So, what would cause these increases in aggregate demand? So once again, I know I'm saying this a lot, but if we really want to solidify this concept, because we're going to reuse it in Module 6 and subsequent modules, aggregate demand is, I would say the way to think about it is it's being increased or decreased by consumer spending. So let's think through all the following in terms of like consumers or consumer spending. So if we have higher expected future income, or an increase in job security. So all the things I'm about to list are going to be what causes an increase in aggregate demand, and I'll mention the reverse, right? But the opposite of all these changes would be that it decreases aggregate demand. So if I think I'm going to have more money tomorrow, or I know that I'm going to have a job, a signed a contract for the next 4 or 5 years, what might I do today? Well, I start living like I already have that money, right? People take out loans when they think that they're going to be able to pay it back in the future, or they think their income's going to be higher down the road. Okay. So increase in future expected income or job security means that people today are much more likely to spend money or consumer expenditure goes up. Remember, that was one of the components of real GDP. So increases in consumer spending or expenditures is going to increase our kind of current real GDP. Or I should say, at every price level, it's going to increase our real GDP or shift our aggregate demand curve. So, what if instead we have an improvement in our exchange rates? So, our currency relative to others is now stronger. That means that we have more purchasing power in that country, which means at the same level of income, we can now buy more from other countries. And so we should see that consumer expenditures go up, or you can think about it as, um, yeah, really can think about it as consumer expenditures are going to increase because our money is worth more. Abroad. And so we should see an increase there in real GDP as well, or a shift to the right. Right? At same price level, even if the price levels in our economy stay the same, if we have more purchasing power in other economies because of improving exchange rates, we'll see an increase in overall consumption. Okay. And then the other things that we're going to think about are lower real interest rates. So if interest rates are lower, that means that borrowing becomes less costly, right? I don't have to pay as much on my loan or as much on my credit card debt when interest rates are low. So for consumers, if I have to pay less money, what do I do with that money? I buy other products. So if the cost of borrowing is low, consumers now have more money left over to buy other products. So that should increase our real GDP. If, for example, interest rates are higher, well, now even if um, I'm likely to borrow a lot less money, which means I don't have as much money to consume products. Or you can think about it as people just don't take out loans when real interest rates are higher, so they don't have as much money to spend. Or even if they take out loans, they now have a higher payment they have to make because of high interest rates, which means they don't have money to spend on other goods. So low real interest rates would increase demand, high real interest rates would decrease demand, right? Or decrease consumer expenditures. Now, we won't really focus on this one. I'm going to kind of punt on this. Um, it's directly related to interest rates, but we won't talk about this relationship until a further module, future module. But higher money supplies or the higher money supply would also increase aggregate demand because it directly influences real interest rates. So kind of by that transitive property, if a higher money supply lowers real interest rates, that should increase consumer expenditures or increase real GDP. Once again, this is linked to interest rates, but we won't kind of focus on this for module 5 or 6. We'll introduce this later on. The other one we can think about are tax decreases. So if taxes go down, people now have more money to spend, consumer expenditures go up, we're now generating higher real GDP. Or improvements in economic conditions abroad. Well, during war times, company, countries aren't as likely to be trading with other countries. They're focusing on military products. Once things improve, we now are much more likely to be trading with these countries. So if we are, things improve abroad, we're likely to see an increase in exports. Or you think about it, if you don't want to think about it that way, consumers are buying more things from abroad. So same idea, increase in exports or increase in consumption would increase our aggregate demand or our real GDP. Okay. All right. So that should set us up pretty good to start going through the next thing. So those are all the things that we'll talk about that shift aggregate demand. We could probably break this down into more subcategories, but for the sake of what we're doing, those are the main kind of shifters. So I already drew one of these out for you, but what does a demand decrease look like? Well, that would mean that at every price level, our real GDP is now less than it was before. And that's going to be true at every price. So a leftward shift in our demand curve, our aggregate demand curve, is actually representing a decrease in aggregate demand. And then if at every price level, people now want to buy more, right? That's going to be a rightward shift or an increase in aggregate demand. So once again, hopefully if you've had B251, this idea of doing demand shifts shouldn't be that new. There shouldn't be any like really new information. Shifts to the right or increases, shifts to the left or decreases. Okay. Oops. So I already identified this earlier when we drew things out, but where is our equilibrium kind of price and real GDP? Well, it's wherever our long run aggregate supply hits our long run aggregate demand curve or aggregate demand curve. So here's our equilibrium price and quantity. Okay. So what if we kind of complicate this a little bit? So one way to think about this equilibrium is whatever is currently being produced is also being consumed. Okay. What happens if we have one of those factors of pull increase? So productivity or technology improves, labor supply increases, other resources, or we can think about physical capital levels increase, or human capital education increases. Well, if any of those things go up, remember, aggregate supply is like our potential output, our maximum output. Well, if we have more resources, we can get to a higher level of output, or we can the ceiling on how much we can produce is increased. So the nice thing is this lines up with shifts in demand because if we have long run aggregate supply increases, that's a shift to the right. Anything that increases output, right? Holding constant everything else, right? So this is our pull acronym, increases our long-run aggregate supply or shifts it to the right. If that occurs, what happens? Well, our new equilibrium is going to be, oh, there we go, is going to be at a lower price level, but a higher real GDP. So don't get this twisted the way that this slide is kind of written and displayed. It's not that deflation is causing this. We are kind of working in reverse. So what would cause deflation? If we had something that increased long run aggregate supply, that would lower equilibrium price levels, which would then do what? Well, if price levels are lower, that would be long run deflation. Okay. Any questions on that idea? So what else could cause this? Well, what if instead we had decreases in aggregate demand? So I'll kind of draw this out for us. I lost my marker cap there. So let's say, and actually this marker's kind of dying on me, so if you don't mind, I'm going to draw with green here. So let's say we start out, no, this one's dying on me too. So let's say we've got real GDP here. I've got price levels. We have this long run aggregate supply and our aggregate demand, right? So our initial kind of real GDP, I'm just going to shorthand this with real and price, we're right here. Well, what happened if we saw a decrease in aggregate demand? Well, if I see a decrease in aggregate demand, we said that was a shift to the left. At every price level, output is now lower than before. So where is our new equilibrium? Well, our new equilibrium real GDP actually hasn't changed, right? And let's think about why. Well, when prices change, that doesn't influence how much our economy can produce. That is not something that impacts pull, productivity, labor supply, physical capital, or human capital. So when we have shifts in demand, so here when aggregate demand decreases, that's going to push prices down, but our real GDP in the long run hasn't changed from that potential point. When we had shifts in aggregate supply, that did change our real GDP equilibrium in the long run. Okay. But here for shifts in aggregate demand only changes the prices. Also, to line up with the slide, what's happening in the long run decreases in aggregate demand, then increase prices. Sorry, not increase. Sorry, decrease prices, or we've seen deflation there. Since we're here, oh, I want to stay here. Um, let's think about if the reverse was true. So let's say instead of an aggregate demand decrease, so we've got prices, got our long run aggregate supply, got our aggregate demand curve. We started out, here was our initial equilibrium price, and here was our initial equilibrium real GDP. What if instead of an aggregate demand decrease, we saw that at every price level, real output is higher, or people are spending more, and we saw an aggregate demand increase? Well, what is that going to do? That pushes our new equilibrium price up, but once again, does not change our real GDP. So aggregate demand increases cause prices to go up, but don't change our real GDP at all. So if prices have went up, what did this aggregate demand increase cause? Long term or long run inflation. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? So just like before, if we had deflate, like what caused deflation, that was increases in long run aggregate supply. So if I now think about, let me go back so you guys can see these slides. If we then think about what instead would cause inflation, well, we could have an increase in aggregate demand, which we looked at, and prices went up, right? We saw that caused inflation. What didn't change? We said real GDP. What else could cause inflation? Well, what if long run aggregate supply decreased? Right? So I'll kind of draw this out for us here in a second, um, as we do simultaneous changes later. But let's think about, we could just use the, where is it at? Went back too far. There we go. Instead of thinking about aggregate supply increases, we knew that that drove down prices. If I saw long run aggregate supply decrease, that's just going to drive up my prices. Well, if prices are higher, that's where we would have inflation. So anytime we have a decrease in something that, sorry, in a factor that decreases long run aggregate supply, we know that prices are going to go up or we've got inflation in the long run. Now, decreases in aggregate supply are a lot less likely for us to see in the real world because, I mean, what do we would need? We would need productivity or technology to actually devolve. I don't know when the last time it's happened. Maybe in long periods of war, technology gets lost or something. I guess the Egyptians might be a good example of this. Um, Really, usually physical capital, we don't see decreases in human capital. There's not many countries who take steps backwards in their education levels or skill levels. Now, the one we could see and most likely are decreases in labor supply. So I think about currently, if birth rates are less than two, so at some point our supply, even the potential, our population is going to go down. So we could see a decrease in labor supply cause a decrease in long run aggregate supply. Or sorry, yeah, I said that right. My bad. I want to make sure I'm not tongue tying myself here. Okay. So we kind of went through. I didn't draw this one out, but I think from using the old depiction, we could come up with this summary of the shifts in both aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay. So when aggregate supply changes, there we actually see changes in the price level and in real GDP. Okay. However, if we kind of see these aggregate demand increases or decreases, and actually it looks like here, I left off a phrase of both of these. I might have been copying and pasting. Whoops, going a little bit too quick there. So I'll repost these slides to make sure it includes these. We said, oh my gosh, if I can spell. There we go. We said that whenever I have aggregate demand shifts, because potential GDP hasn't changed, that actually won't cause any changes in real GDP, only in price levels. Okay. So we're then gonna go one step further. Okay. Where are we at in time? Got 30 minutes left. Okay. All right. Well, I think we'll have plenty of time for this. We might save a little bit of time at the end to kind of go over something, but um, we can now think about we have these factors that are going to shift aggregate demand or shift aggregate supply. Okay. So what if these things happen simultaneously, right? So the answer ultimately is going to be it depends, and we'll kind of think through different examples. So the first one we're going to look at, let's assume I have aggregate supply, oops, aggregate supply decreases and long run aggregate supply increases. Okay. And I think we'll have enough time to work through all the different scenarios. I'll draw them out slightly differently, um, but I think this will be helpful in visualizing it. So let's say I start with the initial example that we had in the slides. So I said, I'm going to once again shorthand real GDP with real. We've got prices, right? I've got my aggregate demand curve, and I've got my long run aggregate supply curve. So anytime you have simultaneous shifts, I think probably the easiest way to do this is draw out each shift individually. Okay. So the first thing we said is, let's say we have an aggregate supply decrease. So what would this look like? Well, I just mentioned one thing, really the most practical thing that we would have change that would cause long an aggregate supply to decrease is a decrease in our labor supply. So we could think about this like, okay, if there's a decrease in our labor supply, that's going to cause a decrease in our long run aggregate supply curve or a shift to the left, right? So what did this aggregate supply decrease do? Well, compared to before, here was our initial price and our initial real GDP. After that long run aggregate supply shift, we now see that prices are higher, but also our potential GDP has actually went down. So decreases in aggregate supply cause prices to go up, but real GDP to go down. Okay. What if instead, at the same time, I had an aggregate demand increase? So I'm going to start to use examples because the quiz in the next exam will do that, and we'll kind of continue to use these in Module 6. So let's say I have that real interest rates. Well, in the example, I want aggregate demand to increase. So what's going to be friendly to consumers if interest rates are lower? That means that if I have loans, I'm paying less money and have more money to buy other products. Or if interest rates are lower, right? Um, I just don't borrow. I don't spend any money on investments and I just consume, right? So either way, we're going to see that there's this increase in my aggregate demand curve, which is going to do what? Well, my initial prices and real GDP when I was in equilibrium were right here. After that decrease in my interest rates, we saw that aggregate demand increases or shifts to the right. What does that do? My new equilibrium point is at higher prices, but the same real GDP. So if I kind of stack these up, my aggregate demand increased, caused prices to go up, but my real GDP to stay the same. Okay? So what's the total effect going to be? So if I think about here, what is the total effect if both of these things happen simultaneously? Well, they both push prices up, so I know prices have to be higher. One of them caused real GDP to be lower, the other didn't cause a change, so I know my real GDP here would also go down. Okay. So this is a little bit different than like B251 when we were looking at product markets. Because simultaneous shifts, if it's the right combination, aggregate supply decrease and aggregate demand increase, I can actually say definitively what's going to happen. Okay. So, are there any questions on this before I give you a kind of a more complicated combination of shifts? Okay. I think before the next complicated one, I just want to prove a point here. So, we'll kind of do a similar thing, and I'll probably go through it relatively quickly. So if I've got my real GDP here, prices, aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply. I've then got long run aggregate supply. I've got my aggregate demand. Okay. So I have my initial price and my initial real GDP right here. I'll kind of put this up here as well. Okay. What if instead I have one of the factors of pull? What did we do before? Yeah, so what if they increase? right? So maybe this is like human capital increases. Well, what is that going to do? It's going to cause an increase in my long run aggregate supply or a shift to the right, right? What does that do to the equilibrium point? It increases my real GDP, but it lowered prices. So this long run aggregate supply increase is going to cause prices to be lower, but my real GDP to be higher. Okay. Now, if simultaneously I saw an aggregate demand decrease, how could I see that? Well, let's say, I don't know, taxes go up. People have less money, they can't consume, or expenditures will be lower than they were before. What impacts is this going to have? Well, my new equilibrium is going to be at the same level of real GDP if that's the only thing that shifts, and then my prices will be lower. So when I'm thinking about this aggregate demand decrease cause prices to be lower and no change in my real GDP. So what is the total effect? Well, if they happen simultaneously, I know prices will be lower and I know that the real GDP would go up. Okay. So when I have simultaneous changes, what will be the case is that the thing that dictates what happens to real GDP will always be, I'm going to reiterate this, will always be the supply shift. The demand shift, if nothing else changes, oh, sorry, here we go. The demand shift will never change real GDP. The only thing that changes our real GDP in the long run is anything that changes our potential or our maximum level of GDP, which is only that aggregate supply curve. So notice in this case, what was the change in real GDP? It was the change that came from supply. What was the change in real GDP? It was the, if we had simultaneous changes, it was the change that occurred from aggregate supply. Oh, sorry, there you go. Okay. Now, where could we get a slightly more complicated or a more maybe interesting example might be a better word for it. And I'm going to draw these out on the same graph. I would suggest when you're trying to break this down to do it on two separate graphs like we did for the other examples. But there's something else I want to show you, which is why I'm going to put them on the same graph. I can't really do if they're on different graphs. So let's say here is my long run aggregate supply. Okay. And let's say that initially, um, what do I want here? Okay. So let's say I've got an increase in productivity or technology. What is that going to do? It's going to increase the amount of output I can produce in my economy or cause a rightward shift in my long run aggregate supply curve. So if I think about what impacts is that going to have, my previous equilibrium price was here and my previous starting real GDP was right here. After that long run aggregate supply increase or shift to the right, that's going to push prices down, but my real GDP up. So prices up, real GDP also goes, or sorry, I'm saying prices don't go up. How did I draw this? Prices go down, right? Call me out if I say something like that wrong or I do something like that wrong. I'm going talking while I'm writing. Sometimes I make these errors. So that's the effect of just that long run aggregate supply increase. So what I'm going to do next is try to draw this very carefully. So let's say at the same time I had exchange rates improve. Well, that means that our value of our currency now has more purchasing power overseas. So we're going to get this increase in aggregate demand. Now, I'm going to draw this as a very small increase, very small shift to the right, because I want to highlight something that can occur. So if I ignore the long run aggregate supply chain, what did just that increase in demand do? It pushed up my equilibrium price, but it didn't cause any change in real GDP. So this aggregate demand increase caused prices to go up, but no change in my real GDP. So once again, if I'm thinking about the total effect here, I know that if I combine these two effects, GDP has to increase. Once again, if aggregate demand doesn't impact real GDP, the total effect from a simultaneous change will be dictated completely by our aggregate supply shift. Now, what happens to prices in the long run? Well, they're both pushing prices in opposite directions, so the answer would be, I don't know. Right? I'd have to know which of those effects is larger. So the way that I drew this one, right, just to kind of make this point, is that aggregate demand increase was much lower than my aggregate supply increase. I tried to draw this, to scale, right? Very small aggregate demand increase, very large aggregate supply increase. So what happens? Well, if this is the case, the price change from long on aggregate supply should be the one that dominates. I guess I should have written this in red. So it should be I see prices go down. Sure enough, if I use my new aggregate supply and my new aggregate demand curve, think about kind of where the total effect price would be and where would the total effect of real GDP. Well, notice real GDP is the same point that resulted because of that longer aggregate supply chain. But our price, in this case, it goes down because that long run aggregate supply change was greater than the aggregate demand change. If that's not true, the opposite occurred. And where are we at on time? Okay. I think I'll just draw this out because I think we're gonna have enough time. So if the reverse is true, let's say the aggregate demand increase was larger. So instead of identifying all these points, we'll think about, let's say here is my initial aggregate demand, here's my initial aggregate supply. Okay. So my initial price and real GDP started out here. So what happens if I have the exact same scenario? So I've got an aggregate demand and a long run aggregate supply increase. So if I have an aggregate demand increase, let's say it's way up here. It is larger than the small increase I see in my long run aggregate supply. Well, we said before, they're pushing prices in opposite directions. So if now the aggregate demand increase is larger, its effects should be the ones that win out. Well, it wasn't impacting real GDP, so that's not going to matter. But when we have conflicting changes from these simultaneous things that are causing shifts, the one that is larger would win out. So we should see prices are now higher, which sure enough, if I'm identifying where does my new aggregate demand equal my new aggregate supply curve, it's going to be up here at higher prices, and the aggregate supply shift will always tell you kind of what direction the equilibrium real GDP will go. So we had that increase in long run aggregate supply that increases our potential real GDP. And then because that shift in aggregate demand was larger, its effect on prices was the one that kind of dictated what our total effect was. Okay. Any questions on that one before I keep moving? Okay. Um, so I have one more thing I want to draw, but before we do, I want to show you some visualizations and then we can kind of put them in context here. So we talked through this. So using actual data, we can estimate so we're talking about all these shifts, whether or not they're simultaneous or not, cause changes in long run equilibrium prices, which essentially are inflation and deflation. So when we look at most economies, specifically in the US in this example, we generally always see inflation. We don't have deflation. Part of that inflation is going to be coming from aggregate demand increases, and part of it is actually going to potentially be driven by, well, what else caused prices to be lower? That would have to have been aggregate supply decreases. Okay. Um, so these things can happen at the same time. They generally are following kind of a similar trend, right? Aggregate supply and aggregate demand driven inflation. Now, it's a little bit different here, and we'll talk about in module six. This isn't really shifts in long run aggregate supply. It's actually going to be shifts in short run aggregate supply. So it's going to look a little bit different um, when we get to the more complicated model next class. But this kind of highlights there is some supply and demand driven inflation. Okay. Now, if we, instead of thinking about these simultaneous shifts, which we already discussed a little bit, so when I'm looking at this, it's kind of it's like stacking things. So even if this supply driven inflation, even if it was increases in supply, it would maybe represent like decreases, right, or deflation or decreases in prices. I think this graph highlights the next thing that we're going to go through a little bit better. So let's say we had supply and demand driven factors and we could figure out what inflation each of them was causing. So notice if I look at this aggregate demand or demand driven factors, how does that increase prices? We said that was if we had increases in demand. So when increases in demand go up, they were causing inflation. But notice at the same time, we've got supply factors, which sometimes they cause inflation as well. Sometimes they cause deflation. So what's kind of a more unique example is what about this point? So the black line is going to be what the actual um, inflation rate is in that quarter. I think we have it broken down by. So notice here it's 0. So what would we have to be true if prices don't change at all? It would have to be that the inflation caused by one of these changes, so here the inflation that comes from supply factors, is exactly equal to the deflation or price decrease that's coming from demand factors. It's kind of hard to eyeball here, but they look like they're about as equally far away from 0. They completely offset each other. Time periods when those demand increases are much greater than the decreases in prices from supply factors, well, there the actual inflation was still high, right? They don't equally offset each other. That inflation caused by the demand shift was much larger than the inflation caused by the supply factors or the supply shifts. So what's a good visualization of this? Um, so I already drew you one where you could identify the kind of large shifts versus the non-large shifts. But the reason why we say it's indeterminate is yes, the effect on prices could be that they increase or decrease, but I'll show you a third scenario, which was using this idea that we just talked about, looking at that visual representation of demand-driven and supply-driven inflation. So if I'm looking at my initial price, I need to get some more black markers from downstairs today, and my initial real GDP. Let's say I have, what do I want here? What's the other example? Okay. So let's say I see, once again, I don't know, education, or for whatever reason, maybe this is times of war, we see a decrease in human capital. So what that's going to do, it's going to decrease our long run aggregate supply curve, right? Now, if at the same time, simultaneously, we also had, let's say that, what's one we haven't went through yet? Let's think about What if people think there's going to be a recession? So they think that there's going to be lower expected future income. Well, what is that going to do? It's going to cause aggregate demand to decrease or shift to the left. And I try to draw this. I'm a little bit off here, right? But where is my new equilibrium point? Where does my new aggregate demand hit my new aggregate supply? Notice I could have it that prices don't change at all. Now, real GDP was always going to be dictated by that supply shift. So I still see my output or my real GDP goes down. But if I had equally sized demand and supply changes, we say that price changes are ambiguous. They could go up, down, or they could even stay the same. Okay. So we went through a lot of simultaneous change examples. Um, I could ask you questions like what's going to happen to prices, and I could tell you that one of these effects is larger, and you should be able to kind of give me a answer there. Um, but those are all, I think all we covered every single combination of those simultaneous changes and really tried to hit home on some of their corresponding effects. Any other questions on that before we keep moving here? And did I see something in the chat? No. So I'll update the slides as well. I copy and pasted this from the whole class, and I realized I need to update. This one should actually be that real G. So I have, or wait, no, I did update this. Sorry. Right. Remember when we had aggregate demand changes? That should always be that real GDP doesn't change at all. So we always know what's going to happen to real GDP no matter what scenario we have. The only time where we have indeterminate answers are when we have simultaneous aggregate supply and demand shifts that go in the same direction. So either they both increase or both decrease. There we said we would need to know the relative size to know what happens to that equilibrium price level. Questions on that? So it looks like I forgot price level here. I might just shorthand this and make them all prices, but we can think about this as kind of a long run price. I'll make sure that they're all consistent um, after class today. So that really should take us all the way through module 5. The only thing left that we have to do today is this daily quiz. And I've got some comments that I need to make after the exam or about the exam, not after it, but all right. So I think I have this set to be 10 minutes, so we should be able to go through this pretty quickly. Um, and this is because if we just have individual changes, right? If I see a shift in long run aggregate supply and it shifts it to the left, which of the following could cause that? So let's remember aggregate supply, probably the best way to think about it is its changes in output. So if I see a decrease or a shift to the left, no matter if we're looking at aggregate supply or aggregate demand, that's going to be a decrease. So what are the things that could cause decreases in our output or our long run average or our long run aggregate supply? So we said the things that increase it are things that increase productivity. So increase in capital, increases in labor, increases in productivity, or increases in education. So which of the following is going to shift it to the left? Well, leftward shifts would be decreases. The only thing that decreases my output or my long run aggregate supply should be that decrease in education. Okay. And then which of the following causes shifts to the right in aggregate demand? Well, shifts to the right are increases. So which of the following are going to cause increases? Well, if I have low or increased amount of taxes, well, is that going to increase? No, I have less money to spend, and so we can't consume as much. Aggregate demand won't shift to the right, it'll shift to the left. If we think that there's going to be lower expected future income, once again, if I don't think I'm going to have as much money tomorrow, I don't spend as much today, consumer expenditures goes down, and my real GDP, not my real GDP, sorry, my aggregate demand curve shifts to the left or decreases. So the thing that would shift it to the right or increase it, the only option we have left is decreases in the real interest rate. So this one is the one that you have to be careful on because when real interest rates go down, right, that actually is a good thing for consumers. They aren't spending as much on the loans that they took. They have more money left over to buy other things. And so expenditures, when we have real interest rates lower, consumer expenditures are actually going to go up, which increases aggregate demand or shifts it to the right. Okay. So there, that was kind of our decrease in real interest rates. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? And then which of the following is going to result in price increases? So here I've got kind of two, or sorry, four answers. So if prices change, so when we were talking about things that shift the aggregate supply and demand curve, they change the long run equilibrium prices. But if the initial change was not, a shift, the initial change is that the price itself changes. That's going to just move us to different points on the aggregate demand curve. So a change in the overall price level of the economy, if that's the initial thing that changes, we're going to just be looking at movements along that aggregate demand curve. If prices are higher, we're going to be moving up or to the left on the aggregate demand curve. So there we should be thinking about when prices go up, we're going to demand less, or we're moving up and to the left on that aggregate demand curve. It's not shifting, we're moving along that curve. Okay. All right. And then if aggregate demand increases, so shifts to the right, which of the following is not true? Well, if we see the long run aggregate demand increases, we drew this out, that's going to push price levels up. So prices won't stay the same. We know that prices are going to increase, right? Now, also what's going to occur, so this one's kind of easy because if prices go up, we know that they're not going to stay the same. So that's going to be the one that's not true. But let's think about the third option. We said anytime we have aggregate demand changes, our long run real GDP is going to stay exactly the same. We haven't seen a change in pull. The potential level of output or the maximum level of our output or our real GDP has not changed in our economy. Right? Um, However, what has changed, right, is currently people want to buy more or less, right? So yes, that'll change, result in changing of prices. Higher prices, people buy less, lower prices, or sorry, higher prices, people buy less, lower prices, people buy more. But when we think about this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, shifts in aggregate demand will only change the resulting prices in an economy, right? It won't change the real GDP. So that one's also going to be true as real GDP stays the same. So now we've kind of got all of them answered. Plenty of time, right? We've got several minutes left here to kind of get this in and submitted. If you're doing this after the fact and you're watching the video, have it set to be 10 minutes. Okay. Any other questions here? I guess I got one more thing to say about kind of the exam I wanted to say for the end of class, but okay. So, um, couple comments about the exam. So, before I do that, um, I believe tomorrow we'll see how far we get, but I'm gonna have it ready to go, and so I think it'll probably be posted after tomorrow's class. I'm gonna put up the next Canvas discussion. So the way that I created the other one, I'm still getting, I'm getting a little bit of practice in here with doing these. It didn't publish it like the right type of assignment. So I had to go through and manually grade it, which isn't a big deal. I didn't couldn't leave comments on your individual posts. So I basically went through and gave everyone, as long as you posted, you were getting credit for those responses to the other students in your initial post. We're going to have another Canvas discussion. I'm going to tie this into more about thinking about these demand and supply driven inflationary kind of impacts. So I'll get that up likely tomorrow after class, depending on how much material we get through. And I'll talk more about that specific one, but this one I'll actually have where I can look at your actual responses and give you some feedback or respond to them. So I just wanted to mention that. The other thing is for the exam. Uh, Scores were abnormally high compared to like my in-person exams, which tells me likely could just be you got a good batch of students in this section. But I also think people are probably finding ways around this lockdown browser. Um, so I've got a different version that I'm going to use for the next two exams, which I'll put up a test quiz by the end of the week so that we can make sure it's working, kind of like we did this initial lockdown browser. This one will flag more things. You have to have a working camera for it. Um, that, so make sure that thinking about taking an exam, that's your scenario. You have something with a working camera or can use a camera to hook up to your laptop or whatever you're using to take these exams. And I'm going to try to use this one instead. So it's a little more strict or finding able to control for ways that people are maybe finding around this other lockdown browser. So I'll mention that once I post that to kind of run that test assignment to make sure that it's working before the exam. Also, given that everyone did so well, I talked about I can play around with time, but I can also play around with the difficulty of the exam. So, um, given the results in the first exam, I noticed there was two questions, one in particular, that a lot of people got wrong. And when I ran it through AI, lo and behold, AI got that one wrong in the same manner that most people were missing that question. And so I know that I can write slightly more difficult exams and in a way that when making them more difficult, it's going to be harder for these AI tools. So that's what I'm going to do. So I would expect the difficulty level on the next exam is going to increase a bit. Um, I'm sorry to those of you who are doing things the right way, but there's a level of I believe academic dishonesty just, you know, looking at, like I said, exam scores in my um in-person sections versus this, and so I would expect the kind of level of difficulty to increase a bit for that exam two in the final. I'm going to try to use this new lockdown browser, so that's really going to make sure, put even more stress on you that you're taking these quizzes seriously, which they end up being about weekly. We'll get the one posted this week after Thursday's class. If we get through module six completely, I might post it a little bit early. Um, but really take those seriously. I'll get a set of practice problems up um, tomorrow as well, so you can start reviewing module five, module six for that upcoming next quiz. And that's, I think, all the things I want to mention. I'll end the recording here. If you have any other questions, those of you who are still here, I'll kind of leave it open. Otherwise, I know I was a little bit slower in email responses. If you're here or watching this after the fact over the fourth weekend, I'm back in the office every day this week. I should be a lot quicker in getting back to you. And otherwise, I will see you guys tomorrow.